Richard, you formulate your ideas on the concept of probability. Mathematicians talk about probability and have formulas. You have a formula.
Yes, indeed. The probability calculus was first formalized, put into a formal shape by a chap called Kolmogorov earlier in the 20th century, but he was relying on a lot of results about probability which were developed by mathematicians in the 17th and 18th century. And the most famous formula, which is of crucial importance in this context, is known as Bayes' theorem, and that we've illustrated on the screen. Now, these lowercase letters, H, E, and K, and so on, can represent any hypothesis, any piece of evidence, or in philosophical terminology, any proposition you like. But for the purposes of what we're talking about, I'm going to represent by H the hypothesis which is being discussed. And the hypothesis which is being discussed is there is a God, theism. And I'm going to represent by E some piece of evidence. I will take different pieces of evidence in turn. And K is meant to represent background evidence. You may remember that I talked earlier in this segment about how a theory has to fit in with theories in neighboring fields. But when we're dealing with a big theory, there aren't any theories in neighboring fields, so you can forget about the K. It doesn't play any role here. But when we're dealing with narrower theories, it could. Now, P of H on E and K, that is the formula on the left-hand side here, is the probability that there is a God on E, the evidence. Now, let's take each piece of evidence in turn. And the first bit of evidence is there is a physical universe. And that is to be calculated in terms of three further elements. Two of them are on the top line of the right-hand side of the formula, and the other one is on the bottom line of the right-hand side of the formula. And the first element is P of E on H and K. And that is the probability that if the hypothesis is true, you would expect to find a physical universe, or more technically, the probability that if the hypothesis is true, you would find the physical universe. And then the next item on the right of that is P of H on K, which is the probability that the hypothesis, there is a God, would be true on no evidence at all, which is what K is representing. And that is to be divided by P of E on K, which is the probability that you would find the evidence on the evidence that there is a physical universe on the basis of knowing nothing at all. And so what this Bayes' theorem says, first in more general terms, where we can take P, H, and E and K as what you like, is that the probability that a hypothesis is true is the probability that if the hypothesis is true, you would find the evidence, multiplied by the probability that the hypothesis was true before you'd ever looked at the evidence, divided by the probability that you would find the evidence whether or not the hypothesis is true. Now, in terms of the particular hypothesis we're considering, and just this particular piece of evidence that there would be a physical universe, what the formula says is the probability that there is a God on the evidence of the physical universe is the probability that if there is a God, you would find a physical universe. Well, since that's necessary for our existence, and our existence is a good thing, you might think this was reasonably high, not necessarily very big, but something like half, let's say, just to take an arbitrary figure, multiplied by the probability there would be a God whether or not, quite independent of any evidence at all. Now, that's obviously going to be pretty low, but on the other hand, it's not going to be as low as that there would be a physical universe at all, because God is a much simpler thing, and as I commented earlier, simplicity is evidence of truth. So this is going to be fairly low. but it's got to be divided by P of E on K. And that is the probability that you would find a physical universe whether or not there is a God. And since you're only likely to find it if there is a God, this is not going to be very different. The bottom line is not going to be very different from the top line. And therefore, in terms of these three elements, you can assess the probability of the hypothesis that there is a God on the evidence of a physical universe. Now, as I commented, there are other bits of evidence too, and you have to put those into the formula as well. Now, of course, this formula was devised by people who wanted to give exact numbers to these things, but it's generally recognized by many people that this applies whether or not you can give exact numbers to things. And when we're dealing with scientific theories or hypotheses of detectives, clearly you can't give exact numbers to things. You can't measure the probability that quantum theory is true. You can only say it's high or low. But what the formula bears out is that the greater the elements on the top of the right-hand side of the formula, the more probable it will be that the hypothesis is true, and the greater the elements on the bottom line, the less probable it will be, because you obtain the overall probability by dividing the top line by the bottom line. And therefore, what this formula bears out is the greater the probability there would be a God, for getting any evidence, which is what we call the prior probability of the existence of God, and the greater the probability that if there is a God, you would find the evidence, which is what we call the posterior probability of the evidence, divided by the probability that you would find the evidence whether or not there is a God, which is the posterior probability of the evidence. The posterior probability, the probability that there is a God on the evidence, is greater. The greater the prior probability there's a God, the more you would expect that evidence if there is a God, the less you would expect that evidence anyway. And the formula bears that out. And all you can do is say, well, this is high, this has a medium value, so that's high. And that captures the kind of thing that I have expressed by my four criteria.
And what you do is apply that formula, that way of thinking, to each of the broad categories of looking at the existence of God, the existence of a universe, the nature of consciousness, various kinds of things. And then, in summary, sum all of those together.
Yes, indeed. It will be too complicated to explain how you put them together, but anyone who is committed to this formula, and many people who work in this field, whether they are theists or atheists, are committed to, or work in the philosophy of science or work in probability theory anyway, whether or not they are atheists or theists, are committed to this formula, they would not dispute the mechanism that I use for putting this together. They would dispute the particular, as it were, input I give. They would say that there's no particular reason for expecting there to be a physical universe if there is a God, or there is no particular reason for the probability that on no evidence at all there is a God would be infinitesimally low, or something like that. And then I would talk about this and say why I think that isn't the case. But the apparatus is not really disputed, in fact. And you can... the cumulative force comes out the more evidence you put in, which is such as if the hypothesis is true, you would expect to find it, and if the hypothesis is false, you wouldn't expect to find it. The more evidence of that kind that comes in, the greater the probability of theism overall.
And you would conclude, by pulling it all together, that the cumulative probability is what?
Is significantly greater than half. That's all I can say. You can't give anything more than exact values to that.